Well, welcome to a Christmas edition of the More to the Story podcast. I'm so glad you all have come along, and we are going to talk about one of the most important things that's ever happened in the history of the world, and that's the incarnation of the eternal Son of God. Now, we're also going to talk about the historical and theological components to the narratives in Matthew and Luke's Gospels. But there's a bigger picture at play here, which we're going to highlight in just a little bit, because much of historical scholarship has just assumed that these documents are not meant to be understood as historical, or even from some evangelical scholars have made that assumption. So I'm really excited to introduce my guest to you here in just a second. But first, this podcast comes to you from Wesley Biblical Seminary, where we are developing trusted leaders for faithful churches. And we do that through a host of programs: bachelor's, master's, doctoral degrees. We have certificate programs. We have our Wesley Institute aimed at lay people. We've just received a really wonderful blessing to get a grant from the Lilly Endowment to emphasize co-vocational and oral preference learners. This is actually a $10 million grant that we've received. So we're so thankful for the opportunity to emphasize these areas going forward. In addition to certificate programs we have with groups like the Global Methodist Church, we have a course of study program for the GMC. So we'd love for you to check us out at wbs.edu for more information. Also, I'd love for folks to sign up for my email list at andymillerthird.com. That's andymillerIII.com. And if you sign up for that list, I'll send you a tool called 5 Steps to Deeper Teaching and Preaching. And this walks you through the inductive Bible study method with the aim of thinking about presenting what you're studying. Also, if you go to my website, you'll see some things that I have there. There's a study on heaven, hell, and everything in between. There's a study on the book of Jude, a study of the doctrine of holiness. These are things that people can use in small groups or Sunday school classes or just in their own personal studies. So I'd love for you to check that out at andymillerthird.com. All right, I am glad to welcome to the podcast my friend, Dr. Caleb Friedeman, who serves as a David A. Case Chair of Biblical Studies and Associate Research Professor of New Testament at Ohio Christian University. Caleb, welcome back to the More Story podcast.
Hey, Andy, thanks for the invitation.
And it's interesting to say you're the Case professor because your dad is a John Case professor here at Wesley Biblical Seminary. Of course, I should have said in my introduction, you're an alumnus of our institution as well.
That's right. Yeah, you got the Friedeman double case professorships, I suppose.
That's right. It works out really well. And so we've had you on in the past to talk about various other things that you've published. You've been involved with various things connected to the Church of the Nazarene, written a book with a few other authors on the doctrine of holiness. But today I'm holding up your book. We're looking at your new Baylor University book, that Baylor University Press, that is, called Gospel Birth Narratives and Historiography.
Historiography, yeah. Historiography.
I just knew the word wasn't coming out of my mouth, so I'm just admitting it there. Reopening a closed case. And I knew if anybody could help me, it'd be you. So, you and I have talked about this book when we've seen each other the last few years, some of your interest in this area. But I'm really fascinated by this book, even though I can't say the title's name. So now why has this been a closed case, Caleb?
That's a great question. So what's interesting to me, I got into this as I was preparing for doctoral research, and I decided that I wanted to focus on the gospel birth narratives largely because of the use of the Old Testament in those narratives. There's just a lot of fascinating use of the Old Testament throughout both Matthew and Luke's birth stories. But as I began to read the secondary scholarly literature on those parts of the Gospels, I just repeatedly encountered this claim that ancient birth narratives were not intended to be historical, and therefore the gospel birth narratives probably weren't intended to be historical either. So, very practically, if we're saying something like born of the Virgin Mary in a creed, is that intended to be a historical claim in Scripture or not? Or is that just a way of saying that Jesus has a special relationship to God, right? Is it just a theological claim that doesn't really have a historical basis? What did Matthew and Luke even intend to say at those points in their stories? So one way you can kind of observe how this pays out, though, across the scholarly literature is by looking at historical Jesus scholarship over, let's say, the last 50 years or so. I do this in the introduction to the book, but I make a run through some of the major monographs. And I'm not talking about short studies. I'm talking about lengthy ones in most cases, hundreds of pages of ink spilled over this. But, if you look across many of those major monographs, you'll be hard pressed to find much attention.
I mean, I have one right here. Here's N.T. Wright's Jesus and the Victory of God. Most people would look at that as like one of the most important books in the last 30, 40 years on historical Jesus scholarship. And we highlight that it has 2 sentences talking about the birth narrative, right? Right. Yeah. And what's interesting there is that, N.T. Wright is actually, in some sense, an evangelical scholar, certainly Orthodox. I don't know, if he would claim the American evangelical label quite so readily, but certainly he's, broadly speaking, an evangelical scholar in the British sense. But so he does think that there's historical value to these stories. And the reason that he doesn't say a lot about the birth narratives in that book, I don't think it's because he doesn't find historical reality there. I think it's because he knows that he can't afford to if he wants to actually get to what he wants to say about the kingdom of God and the rest of the ministry and life of Jesus. He won't be taken seriously, which is kind of a crazy thing to think about, given N.T. Wright's stature, even when he wrote that book, right? Right. Sure.
So you'll have scholars who really actually do find historical value in these stories and just can't afford to say that outright. And then you'll have other scholars who just flat out don't think that there's historical value in these stories. So that's really the case that I'm trying to reopen here, is to say, well, what if these stories actually are intended to be true? Right. And also, what if they fall far closer to the events they're talking about than most ancient biographies did? So that's really what I'm trying to get at. Just one kind of key distinction that I make at the beginning of the book that will probably be relevant throughout this conversation. I talk about 2 kinds of skepticism that scholars have leveled at the birth narratives. And by the way, these 2 kinds of skepticism we use all the time in historical research in general. And they're what I call skepticism of intent and skepticism of truth. So skepticism of intent basically says, I don't think this source is intended to be a historical source. So, for example, something I mentioned in the book is if someone were trying to write a life of the historical Don Quixote using Don Quixote, the novel, well, you might just kind of pause that person and say, well, wait a second, that story isn't really meant to be historical, so you're just off on the wrong foot. And that would be a valid claim to make, right? The other kind of skepticism is skepticism of truth. And so skepticism of truth is saying, well, this source probably is intended to be historical. I just think that the author gets some things wrong, right?
Yes.
And obviously then you have to go sort of claim by claim and say why you think that this particular claim might be correct or incorrect. What's fascinating about those, though, they're both valid if used properly. But what's really interesting is that skepticism of intent is far more efficient if you can pull it off. Right. So if I can convince you that the source in front of you is far more like Don Quixote than it is like, let's say Thucydides or something, some real historical writing, then we don't really need to talk about the historicity of individual events because we just sort of cut the thing off at the roots.
Okay, I want to come back to that because we think about what Andrew Lincoln's claim is. That's really he's claiming they're not intending to be true. But I want to jump into a deeper theological conversation about this first, and that has to do with the doctrine of inerrancy. Because I think this is helpful. Is if, like, for instance, the Lausanne statement says on Revelation, on the doctrine of Revelation, the Bible is true in all that it affirms, or sometimes it says all that it teaches. So that fits into this idea of intent. As long as it's like just intending to communicate a general truth, that's what people have assumed. Like, okay, well, we don't really think that all of these things needed to have happened, but the idea is true. Like it does. For instance, people might think it extreme that Mary and Joseph in Matthew's account go to Egypt, all of those type of pieces or whatever, or even the genealogies. How does this connect to the doctrine of inerrancy?
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting. I think one could potentially, with a certain view of inerrancy, be an inerrantist and accept sort of this more critical standpoint, right, that I've articulated, where the skepticism of intent. You might say, well, ancient birth narratives really weren't intended to give historical information, and Matthew and Luke are taking that on and are operating within that genre. And so when I read these stories, if I want to read them in line with Matthew and Luke's intent, then I shouldn't actually expect to find historical information there. So one could actually accept that and remain an inerrantist. And actually, I think that that's part of the powerful thing about this. You know, some critic of me, now that I've written this book, might say, well, Caleb, you're only taking this position because you're an inerrantist. And what I want to say is, no, I don't have to take the position I take because I'm an inerrantist, right? I'm taking this for historical reasons.
Right, sure.
So actually, I think
because you could go to Lincoln's position.
Oh, certainly. Yeah. So I could say, well, I don't think that these stories are intending to give us historical reality. And therefore, when I read them in that way, I'm reading them in line with what they affirm, right? Or with the ethos on or with what they teach. So actually, I would say I don't have to take this view as an inerrantist, but at least a certain kind of inerrantist, right? At least with the Lausanne kind of view. However, I do think that I need to take it as someone who is historically honest. And the other thing I'd add is that I also think I need to take the view that I take as a confessing Christian who believes the Apostles' and Nicene Creeds, because while there are scholars like Andrew Lincoln who have argued that, well, all that the creeds are doing is summarizing what Scripture is saying. And therefore, if I make a certain decision about what Scripture is saying, well, then I can go back and reread the creeds in a different way. I really don't think that's how the creeds are supposed to work. I think they are summarizing what Scripture says, but they're also telling us how we need to read Scripture if we're Christians. And I think it's very clear, if you go back and read the Church Fathers, that they are thinking of the key claims in the birth narratives as being historical claims. Born of the Virgin Mary is not merely a nice way of saying that Jesus is special or has a special relationship to God. It is a historical claim, and I think that that's quite self-evident. So I would say, as a creedal Christian, I need to take the kind of position that I take. But interestingly, not necessarily as a certain kind of inerrantist. So, and I think that's a good reminder that the doctrine of inerrancy does limited work.
Yes, right? That's right. Yeah.
And so what it does is it keeps someone from saying, well, Scripture says X, and I affirm not X, or I deny X, right? So it does serve that important function, but it's not the whole package. We also need some other Orthodox Christian commitments to accompany that if we're really going to be, I think, what we need to be as Christians.
Yeah, so it's helpful to say, to ask the question, what is this text and what is this author trying to do? And this author is without error in all that he or she is trying to accomplish. So that's one step, but there's a way that, again, a good post-liberal like the Yale School from the 70s, like with George Lineback and the like, even like somebody like Stanley Hauerwas could adopt that type of view. But to your point, we are talking about things with historical reference. And if that's the case, then we're talking to things that are making claims about events happening in history. It's not only just kind of a literary device. Is it, and I brought up the example of Mary and Joseph going to Egypt. Is it important that the Bible, that Matthew makes that claim? Let's just jump into that one. I know we'll step back. I want to get back to methodology too, but maybe we could use that as an example here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly important to Matthew, and he's the one who, of course, the only one who narrates that event. I think one of the ways you can see that it's important to him as a historical event is that he actually talks about it fulfilling Scripture.
Yeah.
Right? This happened in order to fulfill what Hosea said, right? And I think fulfillment only really makes sense if there actually was something that happened.
Right, sure.
Right. I'm not sure what the value of that claim is. And I'm not the first one to have pointed that out. I think R.T. France actually makes that point quite forcefully, and I think I quote him to that effect in the book. But yeah, what's the point of saying something happened to fulfill if nothing happened at all?
Right, sure.
Right. But just say I have a nice theological point to make about Jesus, and it doesn't matter if it happened, right? And that's not the way that Matthew tends to roll. So yeah, I think that it is important to Matthew, and therefore it should be important to us as well.
Yeah, that's great. That's really helpful. So we have these two types of skepticism. There's a skepticism of intent. So if the original authors were ever intending something to happen, but then the skepticism of truth. Could you go back over that one with us just one more time so that we can get that framework in mind as we go forward?
Yeah, so skepticism of truth would just be to say, I'm accepting that this source in front of me is a historical source. It's intending to report historical events, whether it's a biography or a piece of ancient history or something like that, or whether it's modern, right? But skepticism of truth would say, well, yes, this is a historical source, but I actually think that this historical source is wrong in part or in whole, right? And here are my reasons for thinking that it's wrong. So, for example, pretty much everyone recognizes that Thucydides is a really important ancient historian, and that in his Peloponnesian War, he's writing history, right? But you might actually question whether Thucydides gets all of his details right at certain points, and indeed scholars have questioned that. For example, I believe the Yale historian Donald Kagan, he greatly appreciates Thucydides, but he actually has a book where he talks about some points that he thinks Thucydides got wrong, and he tries to prove that from Thucydides' own writings, right? Yeah. So you could do something like that. So I think we have to regard both of them, and I'm only really dealing with the intent issue in this book, but I do have a couple things to say that are going to have implications for how we grapple with the truth question as well.
Gotcha. And that's what overarching thesis is, that they intended, the gospel writers, Matthew and Luke, intended this to be historical. And
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. And I make that case actually from ancient biographies. So the way that the critical argument has typically gone is something like this. Well, the Gospels are ancient biographies, and birth stories or birth material in ancient biographies was not intended to be historical, and then ergo, as ancient birth narratives, Matthew and Luke are 1 to 2 are not meant to be historical either. So I actually just take that argument on at its roots and say, no, well, I'll accept the first premise, right? The Gospels are ancient biographies. I think that's right. But then actually ancient birth narratives and ancient biographies were intended to be historical, and we can tell that. And therefore, when we read Matthew and Luke, that should be the assumption that we have. And indeed, I think Matthew and Luke also give us additional reasons to think that, not just because they're ancient biographies. You can find clues to their historiographic intent within their stories themselves.
Yeah. Okay. So that's really helpful. And you have kind of like three main dialogue partners who you're disagreeing with here. Meyer, and I've already brought up Andrew Lincoln, which I think was disappointing in some ways, because I've benefited. So I imagine you have too, so much from his other writings, some of his commentaries, word biblical commentary on the pastoral epistles, I think. But I've known him to be kind of like the expert, so to speak, on the genealogies. But it's helpful, to have this kind of clear statement from you, because what he's suggesting is that even the intention was assumed in its time to be legendary. So he's saying that the gospel narratives were never thought to be historical.
Yeah, I think what he's really and maybe not, we're never, at least, because there were probably some Christians in the 2nd century or 3rd century that would have
got
that.
But
But I think from the roots, right? Yeah. So
exactly.
Matthew and Luke themselves and what their first readers would have assumed. Yeah, I think that's what he's really trying to get at. And Andrew Lincoln is a good scholar. He's done some good work, but his book Born of a Virgin ? I don't think is helpful, and he is one of the main scholars that I dialogue with and push back against in this book. So John Meyer, and then Andrew Lincoln is another one as well, and then Robert Miller in his book Born Divine is another one that I take on, and largely I'm dialoguing with those scholars because there's a strength to their work in that they are really clear about why they're disbelieving the gospel birth narratives, or why they're skeptical, you might say, right? In other places, it's not quite so clear. It's just sort of, you get an atmosphere of skepticism, you might say. But they actually discuss their reasons, and that really gives me something to engage with. So I appreciate the clarity of their arguments in terms of the way that they're articulating why they're skeptical, but I think that the reasons for skepticism are unwarranted.
Yeah. So you make the case for you going through these ancient biographies, and I like, it's interesting too, you have, you use some of the work of Mike Lincona, who endorsed this book It's his work on ancient biographies. He's been on my podcast in the past, and also Craig Keener endorsed your book, and you're slightly critical that he didn't. He was one of those who's done some big work on the historical Jesus too. So, so you use some of these other work as well. Michael Ancona, of course, has done a lot of this study in the ancient biographies, but you're taking it now to level of looking at some other ancient birth narratives. And be honest with you, Caleb, I'm sorry, I wasn't aware of these till looking at your book. So help us understand why these ancient biographies and their birth narratives help set the stage in the literary context for Matthew and Luke.
Yeah. So maybe just to take a quick step back for people who are maybe a little bit less familiar with the scholarly conversation here, there's been a long scholarly discussion about what kind of literature the Gospels are. But most scholars today would agree that the Gospels are ancient biographies, with the adjective ancient being important. So they're not exactly the same as modern biographies, and that's why we need people like Michael Ancona and Craig Keener to do work to help us understand how ancient biographies worked. But there's been some really good work done in the last several decades on that issue. Richard Burridge, his book was one of the main ones that broke that open in the early 90s. And then we've largely been strengthening that consensus. There's still some scholars who would be skeptical of that, but I would say the vast majority of scholars would agree that the Gospels are ancient biographies, or at least the ancient biographies are the closest thing to what we have in the Gospels and our best comparisons. So that's kind of the foundation of it. So here's basically the way it worked for me in terms of discovery. I was reading people like John Meyer and Andrew Lincoln and Robert Miller, and I kept encountering this claim that ancient birth narratives were not meant to be historical. So at some point in there, I said to myself, I need to actually go look at the primary sources and see what's going on there. And by the way, it's conceivable that could be true and that Matthew and Luke are just doing something different. Right? So maybe Matthew and Luke are just doing something, they really do want to give us history, even though most ancient birth narratives didn't. But I decided to go look at these stories that were being cited from these ancient biographies outside the Gospels, and I started reading them, and what I saw in the text just did not match with the story I'd been told by scholars like Meyer and Lincoln and Miller. And here are the kinds of things that I started finding. I noticed that often the ancient biographers would cite their sources. Well, wait a second. Why would you need to do that if you're just writing something that's akin to Goldilocks or Don Quixote, right?
Something up. Yeah.
Right. If this is just a nice theological tale, or just ideological tale, right? They're not always interested in doing theology, but why would you do that? Another thing that they'll do is they'll sometimes note differences among the accounts that they have in front of them. In other words, differences among the sources that they have. So they have more than one source, and they're saying, I'm going to give you a glimpse of the differences, right? And I call this transparency. So when they're sort of pulling back the veil of their narrative and saying, hey, here's what I'm seeing behind this. I'm not just giving you my final product. I'm letting you see some disagreement on the backside of this. And then they'll sometimes go further and evaluate the trustworthiness of an account. Sometimes also while doing transparency, right? So let's say, hey, there are 3 ways this story is told, and this is the best one, and here's why. So I call that evaluation. And then the last thing is something that I've come to call distancing, which is basically where an author will put distance between their reputation and a claim that they find in their sources. So instead of saying something like, well, this Greco-Roman deity had intercourse with this person's mother, and that's how they came to exist, they'll say, it is said that, ... right? It is said that. And so they're not actually wanting to take direct responsibility for that tradition, right?
Wow. Yeah.
So I started finding all these things, and obviously it wasn't quite that clean initially. I started noticing these different things, and then trying to categorize them and see how I might articulate these in a way that made sense to me and might make sense to others. But I've come to call those four things: sources, transparency, evaluation, distancing. I've come to call those historiographic features. In other words, they're indicative of history writing, particularly in the ancient world. And what's interesting is you'll find those not only in birth material in ancient biographies, but you'll also find those same things throughout the rest of ancient biographies. In other words, in adult and youth material as well. And you'll find them throughout ancient history in general. So if you look at Herodotus and Thucydides and Polybius and Xenophon, some of these early historical writers that we have in the tradition, you'll find these really across ancient historiography. So I think there's a good reason to think that when we find these, that they do indicate some kind of historical intent, unless you have something like this. Potentially, somebody could use those in a satirical way, right? You'll actually find source references, for example, in Don Quixote. Right. So you can find sometimes they'll do this in a an author will do this in a satirical way. They're kind of making fun like they're writing something that's historical, but it's very clear that it's not. Right. So you'll find that. And sometimes someone could potentially do this with an intent to deceive. Right. And they could be putting these in simply because they're trying to fool you into thinking it's historical writing. But barring those kinds of exceptional circumstances, I think that we should generally see these as reliable indicators of historiographic intent.
So those 4 areas that you have, they just kind of give further clarity. And so then you go through a study of each of these birth narratives using those 4 areas as a way to help us see the historical nature of this. So so like for instance, like you said, the distancing one, the author's distances their authorial reputation from a claim. So if by doing that, it's saying like it is said, they're like really they're saying, well, by the way, everything else that I'm saying is part of like what we think really happened.
Right. Yeah. So what I do in the first part of the book is I select 4 ancient biographers who wrote within a century of the Gospels. And I try to pick ones also that have multiple birth narratives to look at. So in other words, they wrote more than one biography, and they also have birth material in more than one biography. So I'm able to do that for 3 of them. One of them only has one, but he's so important that I just have to deal with him. So it's Cornelius Nepos. That's the first one I deal with. He was our first biographer who wrote in Latin, at least that we have on record. And then we have Philo, who's the only the author of the only Jewish biography that we have. So his On the Life of Moses. And then I also do Plutarch, who, he's very famous for his lives. Some people call them the parallel lives. And then Suetonius, who wrote a whole series of biographies, but particularly his Lives of the Caesars are extremely well known. So I take those 4, and then I go through and look at a representative sample of their birth material. Obviously, I do a thorough discussion of Philo, and the other ones I kind of have to pick the places that I really want to discuss. So I do kind of selections, and interestingly, Cornelius Nepos is not one of the authors that these critical scholars tend to cite. So I just kind of get carte blanche for where I want to go with him. But for Plutarch, I only discuss lives that people like Andrew Lincoln and John Mayer and Robert Miller have actually cited to demonstrate the opposite conclusion. Okay. So I actually say I'll take you on, and I'll start with the stories that you want to cite, and I'll show you that basically you've misread them. So, and I do that to a degree with Suetonius, but I use a few other lives of Suetonius as well. And then just one other thing that people may find interesting, while I can only discuss so many of these biographies in the chapters of the book itself, I actually, to show that I haven't just cherry-picked examples, even though I've often started with the same ones that the scholars who oppose me are citing, I actually give an analysis of all of them in tables and appendixes at the back of the book. So, and that comes to a total of 95 different biographies that I deal with. And you can go look and see, I give an account of historiographic features and things like their use of omens and miracles, and then something else that I call the time elapsed between, basically the time that transpired between when the person was born and when their biography was written. So that's another really interesting piece of the analysis to see at what kind of historical remove these authors were often working at. And the conclusion there is actually kind of surprising, and especially when you compare it to Matthew and Luke.
Interesting. So is it, with that time elapsed, is it generally longer?
Yeah, so it's quite striking. Sometimes you have as much as something like 800 or 900 years.
Wow.
And of course, for some of those figures, modern scholars might even question whether they existed. So an example of that would be Plutarch writing a life of Theseus or Romulus, for example. So these are some of the earliest figures, and he actually comes right out and tells you that in those biographies. So some scholars would even question whether Theseus and Romulus ever existed, but Plutarch certainly thought they did, right? So yeah, sometimes you have as much as 800 or 900 years, but the average across those 95 lives is over 360 years. So yeah, in general, we're talking, 360 plus years that these biographers are generally dealing with when they're writing these stories. But then you place Matthew and Luke in dialogue with this, right? And, Matthew and Luke, their scholars go back and forth about how much time there was between when Jesus was born and when they wrote their biographies and all that. But, let's say if you just kind of take maybe a broad consensus sort of date, like Matthew and Luke are writing somewhere in the realm of 70 to 80 AD,
Sure.
something like that. I'd probably go lower than that in terms of earlier, but let's just say that still puts them hundreds of years closer to Jesus' birth than the most biographers.
People are still alive. People are still alive who would have seen Jesus, maybe even known Mary at this point, maybe known Joseph too. I mean, the kind of assumption a lot of generally we think is that like Luke obviously investigated very carefully what he's doing, but had some source, maybe Mary herself, but was very closely connected to those birth stories. I mean, who is it makes the case about being Joanna? But like that he had these really close connections to the actual events. And that's also in part why the idea of the virgin birth not being some myth that's developed over time. It's like this is in even if it's the 70s or 80s, like is that enough time for a myth to have developed?
Right.
So I'll let you comment on that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, it really reduces the amount of time that you have for any kind of legendary development to take place, especially if the biographers themselves are not engaging in that legendary development. If they're not contributing to that, right, then what sort of reasons do you have for saying that that's happening? And it's interesting because even in biographies that are written hundreds of years after the fact, we don't really see a lot of that sometimes. Right. Even when they're doing things like transparency and distancing, we don't necessarily see a ton of that kind of legendary development or a lack of trust in sources and things like that. So, yeah, this issue of the time elapsed is one of the ways that I think this project speaks into the question of truth. Right. So if we have skepticism of intent and skepticism of truth, obviously I'm focusing on the intent piece, but I think that this kind of data does speak into how we engage with the truth question.
Yes. I'm curious, you've mentioned a few times that there might be some things with the skepticism of truth that you wonder if things were historical. You're not questioning the kind of with a skepticism of intent. So what did you find? I know we're jumping ahead here out of the ancient sources, but to the accounts themselves. Is there anything that you feel like maybe isn't right? Is it connected to genealogies? What could it be?
Oh, in terms of the Gospels themselves?
The Gospels themselves, like
Matthew and Luke?
Historical accounts, yeah.
Yeah. Well, my main argument is, of course, that Matthew and Luke are intending to write things that are historical, right? So that's where I'm going to put most of my weight. And maybe we can kind of talk about why that first, and then maybe engage with the truth question.
Yeah, I am interested in that.
Helpful.
Because a lot of people, I mean, at this here we're recording this on December 16th, and this is when they're thinking about these accounts a little bit more and their historical veracity. So and a lot of times people want, what's the real story? What really happened? And people like to blow up kind of like the ideas. I know your own mother has a lot of a big collection of manger scenes, right? And so like a lot of people like to say, oh, well, that didn't really happen. The wise men weren't there at the same time as the shepherds. Okay, so we like to blow up those type of ideas, but there is this sense, like, and you also mentioned this earlier, that there were a couple things that you found in addition with Matthew and Luke that kind of bolsters their reliability. So I'm interested in some of that as well.
Yeah, so let's maybe just talk about a few of the really interesting things regarding the intent, and then I do think that's going to have some implications for the truth question. So, yeah, with the intent, one of the things that I found really fascinating in doing this project that I really know to the same degree before is grappling with particularly Matthew, because I hadn't spent as much time in Matthew's birth narrative, and for both of them though, both Matthew and Luke, the genealogies. So here's just an interesting thing. Matthew's genealogy is based significantly on known sources, and by that I simply mean the Old Testament. Okay, so yeah. If you look at Matthew's birth narrative, he's basically drawing on 1 Chronicles 1-3 and Ruth 4. Those are the two major places in Scripture, and you can tell with some of the details that he includes, he's really drawing on both of those. And then that allows you, so he doesn't cite sources. So I wouldn't say that he uses the historiographic feature of sources that I've identified. But what he does do is use sources, and they're known sources, so you can tell how he's used them to a degree, right?
Okay, interesting.
So then if you go and analyze, and I do this in the book, I give a pretty close analysis of how Matthew's using these sources, and you do find some differences between him and his sources. But what's interesting is all those differences. So for example, omitting certain generations. So he might omit several kings in the line of David. Well, that's a very valid thing to do in a Jewish genealogy. That's like a convention that you find, interestingly, even within the Old Testament itself. So you can't really find Matthew doing anything with his genealogy in terms of the range of flexibility within which he's working that isn't already going on within the Old Testament itself. Because if you compare certain genealogies within the Old Testament, sometimes even within the same author, you can find those same kinds of differences. So Matthew's clearly using sources and seems to be using them responsibly. And so then when I get to a figure like, let's say, Ruth, who doesn't appear in those sources, at least clearly, Richard Balkins made an interesting argument about how Matthew might have gotten Ruth out of 1 Chronicles. But even if that's not correct, and he's not getting her from 1 Chronicles, I want to say, well, if he's using sources everywhere else, then he's probably got a source for this, even if it's a non-biblical source.
So you're saying for including Ruth in the genealogy.
Right,
the fact that he
because
Ruth.
Yeah, she wouldn't be one of those. There are some women actually included in 1 Chronicles, which is interesting.
Okay.
So you do find some of the women that Matthew includes already in the Chronicles account anyway. But then, Matthew, Ruth is not one of those, at least in the forthright sense that some of the other ones would be. But I still think that it's likely there that Matthew's drawing on a source. And regardless of what you do with Ruth, I think what you have to say is it doesn't make any sense for Matthew to be drawing on a source at all if he's just spinning this out of thin air. And if all he's wanting to give us is a legendary account. So the use of sources in general is just a really good indicator of his historiographic intent. And then you get to the birth narrative. And interestingly, a lot of scholars have been skeptical of Matthew's historiographic intent there because of the use of the Old Testament. But I would say it's actually the use of the Old Testament that vindicates Matthew's historiographic intent. Because if you look at his famous fulfillment quotations, and he's got 5 of them in the birth narrative, what's fascinating is those fulfillment quotations, the passages that he draws on, it's very hard to see how Matthew would have ever gotten to those passages if he hadn't had a story about Jesus like this one and already in front of him. Right? So like he's not just grabbing a bunch of like classic Davidic Messiah passages. There's one of them that does have to do with David, the line of David and Bethlehem, right? The Micah 5:2 one. But the other ones, like Isaiah 7:14, that's not a passage that you would just naturally grab if you had some general idea about Jesus being the Messiah. And then what am I going to go grab in the Old Testament to help show how Jesus fulfills that, right? It seems like you'd rather need to have a story about Jesus being born to a virgin. And
right.
And then you actually go and decide that Isaiah 7:14 was pointing forward to that, right? So it very much looks like the quotations depend on the story that he has. And then the other interesting thing that scholars have noted is that if you take the quotations out, Matthew actually has a pretty coherent story if you just pull the quotations and then put the rest of the story together. Like the narrative flows. So the narrative doesn't depend on the quotations either. Yeah. So I think both of those factors really suggest that Matthew, not only in the genealogy, but also in the birth narrative proper, is drawing on sources, which is, again, what you do as a historical writer, right? If you're trying to write about something that happened. So he's got some kind of story in front of him. Now, we don't know exactly what that story looked like, but another interesting part that I bring up when I get to Luke is that Matthew and Luke actually share certain points in the birth narrative. Now, they're very different stories on the whole, but you can find some parallel claims between them. Where are those coming from if they're both independently making this stuff up, right? And then if, of course, Luke may be drawing on Matthew, but if he's drawing on Matthew, then, and he's having some points in common, that means that he's using Matthew responsively to a degree, right?
Yeah, sure, and not disagree.
So, yeah. So that's a little bit on Matthew. With respect to Luke, I'll just make a few quick points. Luke, I think, does incorporate historiographic features into his account. The first place I would say would be in his preface, Luke 1:1-4, where he talks about his purpose in writing and also the precedent for his story and the sources of his account. And he specifically notes that he's drawing on those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Now, some scholars have noticed that and said, well, yes, but that doesn't apply to the birth narrative because birth narratives weren't meant to be historical, right? Well, that's a circular argument, isn't it? Because how do we know that? Well,
right, sure.
We don't really, right? We would need to make that an open question and say, okay, what is going on here? So I do think that does apply to the whole birth narrative. And part of the reason I think that is because I found multiple other places in other ancient biographies where you'll have this kind of blanket note about sources at the beginning that applies to the whole thing, right? So, for example, Philo in his biography of Moses, he actually does something very similar where he talks about where he's gotten his information. And then that seems to be what he's drawing on. So he mentions that he's drawing on both the scriptures and on oral traditions that he's received from the Jewish elders. And that does indeed seem to be what he's doing, not just in the birth material, but also throughout the rest of the life. So I think that this claim does apply to the birth material. And that's why Luke puts the preface where he puts it as opposed to after the birth material, right? But then Luke does something else interesting. Within the birth material itself, I argue that he actually indicates that Mary is the source of the story. And that would be particularly in Luke 2:19 and 2:51, where he talks about Mary preserving the words or all the words in her heart.
Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
So I have an extensive analysis of those sayings in my dissertation that's now published with Cambridge University Press. I don't make that whole case here in terms of recapping it, but I summarize it in this book that just came out. And I think when you read those sayings within their Lucan context, and particularly as allusions to Daniel, which I think is what they're doing. I think that he's alluding back to Daniel 7:28. But when you read them in that way, I think that it's very clear that at least one of the things that they're doing is marking Mary out as the source of the account.
Okay, and then Daniel 7:28, help me.
Yeah, something. So Daniel 7, of course, you know this, but
the son of God.
Everybody may not have this on the front of their mind.
Yeah.
So Daniel 7 gives us the account of Daniel's vision of the four beasts, and then the appearance of the Son of Man, and then of course the interpretation of that happens within the vision itself. But what you find interestingly there is that at the end of the account, it says that Daniel preserved the word in his heart, and that's actually verbally, it's the closest parallel to what Luke says in Luke 2:19 and 2:51 that you'll find of any sayings in the ancient world. And the other thing that's interesting there is that Luke has already been engaging with Daniel earlier in Luke 1. So, for example, the angel who shows up in Luke 1 to announce John and Jesus' births to Zechariah and Mary is Gabriel. And Gabriel only appears elsewhere in the Bible in the book of Daniel. So, and there are numerous other allusions that Luke weaves in actually to Daniel 9 and 10 along the way. So there are lots of reasons to think that Luke is looking back to Daniel 7:28 then in this passage. But here's the kind of the fascinating insight. So Daniel preserves the word in his heart, right? Well, preservation in the heart in the Danielic context is coming as a middle stage between two other things. So we could say you have first revelation. So Daniel receives this vision, but then actually at the beginning of the chapter kind of gives you the end game. It says that Daniel saw a vision, or maybe had a dream, and then he wrote it down. Okay. So you have revelation, then what I call communication on the other side. What comes in between those two? Preservation in the heart, right? So before Daniel wrote this thing down, this is what the book is trying to tell us.
Yes.
Before Daniel wrote it down, he preserved it secretly in his heart, right?
Yes, yeah. And
that's why he was able to write it down in the way that he did. So I think in a similar way, Luke then is operating in that context, and the word then, or all the words, and that's interesting, isn't it? He doesn't just say one word, he says all the words. And I think that's because he's thinking about the whole story, not just the episode that precedes that saying. But every scene, so there's 7 scenes in Luke 1 to 2, and every one of those scenes has at its heart some instance of an angel or a human speaking on God's behalf. So it is a revelatory kind of context, right? So you have Gabriel to Zechariah, Gabriel to Mary, Mary and Elizabeth meet, and they are inspired by the Holy Spirit to speak. You have Zechariah's prophecy. You have the angels to the shepherds. You have Simeon and Anna in the temple. You have Jesus in the final scene. So Luke is telling us that all this revelation, right? Mary preserves the word in her heart, all the words, right? All of these things that have happened. She's preserving them in her heart, but notice it's secretly, right? So she's not coming out and saying it yet. And then I think Luke kind of completes the Daniel picture, because where Daniel both receives the vision, preserves it in his heart, and then writes it down, I think Luke, interestingly, is telling us at the beginning of his story that he's the one who wrote it down. So it's kind of like Luke and Mary are splitting the Daniel role, so to speak. So Mary's the one who receives the revelation and then preserves it. Luke is ultimately the one who writes it down.
Wow. Oh, man, Caleb, there's so much there. Yeah, I just did a quick look at the, the NIV probably doesn't give a good translation then of that idea. It concludes Daniel 7 by saying, this is Daniel speaking of himself, but I kept the matter to myself. So it's probably more like what you indicated. Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit more of a paraphrase perhaps at that point. Yeah. And particularly, if people want to check this out in a little more detail, if you don't know the original languages, go take a look at the New English translation of the Septuagint, NETS. You can get it online for free, but looking at the Septuagint is particularly helpful at that point. So yeah, I recap that case in this book,
gotcha.
but the detailed dive on that. I have a whole chapter on the use of Daniel in Luke 1 to 2 in my dissertation. Again, that's the revelation of the Messiah with Cambridge. And I also have a whole chapter on the preservation sayings too, where I make this case at length. But yeah, I do think ultimately, though, what Luke is doing is marking Mary out as the source of the account. Now, that's not to say we haven't said yet what Luke's access to Mary is like, right?
Right.
That's
what do you think that
day.
was? What do you think how he got to Mary, or was he? Like, I don't know. I just can't. I end up thinking like wouldn't this be great? And maybe we'll know in the new creation that this happened.
Yeah.
Like that Luke's sitting down and writing these things down as this happened. I'm asking you to hypothesize here, or I know some people think of it as being Joanna or Junia to be the one who's like somehow made that connection from like Luke 7, I think it is, or Luke 8. But I'm just curious what your thoughts are there.
I don't think that it's impossible that Luke had an interview with Mary at some point. A lot of that's going to have to do, though, with how old we think Mary might have lived to be. And also part of that equation is how old she was when she conceived Jesus in the first place, right? Was she, let's say in her early teens, or was she, some Jewish women, though, were much closer to, let's say, 20 when they got married. So how old was she then? And then how old do we think she might have been? And also, how early did Luke begin to do the research for his gospel? We might, there's when we date the gospel itself, but then how early was he doing the research, and might he have had contact with her? So I think that's, and there are a lot of factors in that equation, but I don't think that we should rule that out as a possibility, at least, because certainly Luke knows of women who can live to be very old, like Anna, right? What is she, 80? I think,
sure.
Something like that, when they meet her in the temple. So certainly Luke is aware of, all. There are 4 characters in his birth narrative. They're extremely old, right? So we have Zechariah and Elizabeth, and then Simeon and Anna. So that kind of thing certainly could happen. But even if we don't ultimately decide that Luke had an interview with Mary, certainly he's going to have access to people like James and Jude,
right,
Peter and John. Of course, there's the Johannine tradition that Jesus actually kind of gives Mary to John, right, for her to care for her, or to the beloved disciple,
or the beloved disciple, whoever you think that is. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So whoever that is, right. But these are the kinds of people that Luke would have, I think, very clear and obvious access to. So even if it's not direct, that still would be a very reliable access to the tradition if he's accessing it through them.
It is. Am I right that we generally think of Matthew as being connected to a source closer to Joseph because he emphasizes Joseph so much, or is that just because Joseph's mentioned, we make that assumption?
Yeah, some scholars have argued that. I think Joan Taylor is probably the most recent in her
Yeah, I had her on my podcast
Boy
recently
Jesus.
about Boy Jesus. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. She makes that case. I guess my issue with seeing that at least as a kind of an alternative tradition outside that's not flowing through Mary is how in the world is anybody going to get that tradition? How's Matthew going to get that tradition if Joseph has probably already passed away by the time Jesus is an adult, right?
Right.
So I think even if you've got Joseph's memories that are being preserved and sort of Matthew's telling it Joseph's way or based on his memories, that's ultimately still going to have to flow through Mary and the other relatives of Jesus to some degree, right? The people who would have known
Right, sure.
Joseph, been able to pass that on. So, yeah, but I think Luke though is far clearer in telling you about
For
Mary
sure.
than Matthew is in telling you about Joseph. So, I think that's kind of where I want to start and then build out from there.
Gotcha. I think the assumption I've heard people say, maybe Joan Taylor said this, maybe even on my podcast, was a connection to Jesus's half brothers, and then that gave the connection, like as if James or Jude would have given that information. But that just recall off the top of my head. It brings up the interesting piece about Joseph. So why do we have a genealogy that traces to Joseph? Theologically, why is it significant given the fact that the claim is so clearly made of the virgin birth?
Yeah. Well, I think probably what's going on there is that both Matthew and Luke are keenly interested in telling us how Jesus is connected to the line of David, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at least on my reading, it seems like Joseph is the clear connection. Some scholars have tried to argue that Mary is also from the line of David, but I don't really find the evidence for that within Matthew and Luke itself. I think certainly the point they want to make is that Joseph is the connection. So then they're both trying to trace that line. Interestingly, though, they're both tracing the line in somewhat different ways. There's some overlap between the genealogies, but certainly in the final stages leading up to Jesus, you have some significant differences. And I think what's probably going on there is that Matthew is tracing one part of the line and that Luke is tracing another line. So you've got some, in other words, kind of a crisscross that happens with a couple figures like Zerubbabel and Shealtiel. I talk about this a bit in the book. So you have kind of a crisscross there where they're going to share some figures, and then I think they're clearly both tracing different parts of the line at the points outside of that crisscross. And I don't do the detailed work on this in this book, but what I find interesting is that those two figures that they share are right around, obviously that they're going to share after David, are actually right around the time of the exile, when there would have been probably a dearth of good candidates to carry on the Davidic line, and hence you probably would have needed, because of all the deaths, right, and the and having things like sieges and all that. So I think there's a good chance that you simply don't have many people who can carry on the line, and so you need to use some levirate marriages or adoptions to keep the line going for both the royal side, right, the royal line, and then also the non-royal line of Davidites that are not kings, right? So I think probably that's what's going on, and then ultimately they're going to kind of connect again at the very end with Joseph. But yeah, but for me theologically, here's one interesting insight that kind of comes out of all that. The big point, of course, is that Joseph is the connection to the line of David.
Right. Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And but also, I mean, Matthew and Luke are both very clear. Joseph is not Jesus' biological father.
Right. Sure.
Right.
It's a huge question.
So that basically means that Jesus's legitimacy as the Davidic Messiah hinges on the legitimacy of adoption.
Okay, interesting.
Joseph basically adopts Jesus into the Davidic line, right?
Gotcha. Wow.
On my reading, that's what you have to assume. And actually, I've written an article arguing that actually was something that existed in Judaism. Many scholars have said that Jews didn't have a practice or concept of adoption, and I've got an article in New Testament Studies where I push back on that and say, actually, there's lots of good evidence for Jewish adoption. But I think that adoption has to work, at least for Matthew and Luke, if Jesus is really going to be a legitimate descendant of David, because that's coming through Joseph, right?
Okay, yeah. Caleb, this is so helpful. I mean, I've maybe leaned into the arguments that I've tried to trace it to Mary, just because just being so honest here, like I I've wanted him to be of the line of David, and I just have I believe the virgin birth, and so I had no other way of making that connection. I never thought of the idea of it being adoption, of how Jesus would be connected, and that that's truly a reality of truly being somebody's child. And you have the same thing, I guess, Pauline language about adoption as well. So I mean, it seems like it's a pretty clear idea.
Yeah. And I think, the other great implication that I think comes out of that, and this is just very practical, pastoral, personal, spiritual life kind of stuff.
Amen,
but,
amen. Yeah.
If God is willing to hinge Jesus' status as the Davidic Messiah on adoption, then adoption must be real.
Wow. Amen.
Right?
Amen. Yeah.
And therefore, when God adopts us as his children, that's not a second-rate kind of status that we receive. It's legitimate, right?
Right. With all the rights and privileges therein. Yeah.
Exactly. So if he's willing to base Jesus as the Davidic Messiah, that status upon that, then what does that say about what it means for us as well? Yeah.
Yeah, that is great. It's so helpful. And maybe some people know the answer to this question already, but I just want to go ahead and ask it. Help us know why it's significant that Luke takes his genealogy to Adam, whereas Matthew brings it back to Abraham.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to say there. Let me just say one thing before I even get there, because I forgot to mention one more historiographic feature that we were talking about. So one thing is interesting in Luke's genealogy is I think he does employ evaluation, the historiographic feature within the account. So at the beginning, he says that Jesus was the son, as was thought, of Joseph, right? So obviously, he's acknowledging a tradition that some apparently thought of Jesus being Joseph's biological son, but and that could simply be distancing, right? Where he's saying, hey, there's this tradition, but I'm not going to put my weight behind it. But I think actually, in light of what he's already said in Luke 1 about the virginal conception, I think that this is actually evaluation where he's giving a negative opinion on that tradition, right? So what's fascinating there is that if that's true, if we have a historiographic feature there, that means that you have Luke citing sources in the preface, in Luke 2:19 and Luke 2:51, and you have an instance of evaluation in the genealogy, which would mean that you have 4 historiographic features that apply to the birth narrative, and that's more historiographic features regarding that material than any other material in the gospel. I don't know any other part of the gospel or Acts where you find that kind of density of historiographic features. So if there's any part of Luke's writing that we think is intended to be historical, I think it would have to be the birth material. So there's just
even more than the resurrection. I gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I would think the other thing is, of course, that you don't have to be using historiographic features to have historiographic intent, right? There are wide swaths of ancient history and historiography in general where you don't have these sources being, or these features being used. So I don't think that they're required, but certainly if we're not sure and we want to ask the question, well, we'd have to say the birth material is at the forefront of what Luke regards as being historical. But your other question though,
the differences between Abraham, going back to Abraham and then going back to Adam. Yeah.
Why back to Adam? Yeah. Well, I think Matthew's very interested in Jesus as the Messiah of Israel, right? And so it's not that he's necessarily denying that he goes back to Adam as well. But I think Luke is very interested in, on the one hand, in talking about Jesus as being the Messiah for the whole world, right? And so he's going to make that point. Of course, Matthew has another way of making that point in the Great Commission, for example, right?
Yeah, sure.
So they're both going to
those things as connected, right?
Exactly.
Like the beginning and the end. Yeah.
Yep. So they're both going to affirm that, but in their different ways. I think Luke, though, Luke's the reason he places the genealogy where he does and the way that he structures it going backwards, I think is significant. So at the baptism, you have the Father affirming Jesus to be his son, right? So the Son of God concept comes up there. And then you go into the genealogy, right? Jesus was the son of the son of the son of the son of, at the very end, the son of Adam, the son of God, right? So now we've had Jesus acknowledged as the Son of God, but also Adam is the Son of God as well, right? Which kind of brings up this comparison, right? What do they have in common? I think the answer is basically they both owe their human existence entirely to God's initiative, right?
Okay.
God forms Adam out of dust, and he conceives Jesus in Mary's womb, right? Apart from kind of the natural processes. So Obviously, the eternal Son exists prior to all that, but
Right.
in terms of human existence, this is where God has this initiative in Jesus's initiating Jesus' life. So, but then where do you head from the end of the genealogy? Well, you go into the temptation, right?
Yes.
So the last thing you hear before you head into the temptation is Adam, the son of God, and then Luke has this temptation in which, interestingly, the first and the third temptations, the ones that bookend it, the devil tempts Jesus and says, "If you are the Son of God," right? Yeah. So I think Luke is trying to. He's encouraging us to compare and contrast Jesus and Adam and the way in which they are sons of God and how they embody that identity.
Yeah, that's so helpful. This is great. So I'm interested going back to Matthew. One of the questions, and you mentioned an emphasis on Daniel. Now I made this claim in a sermon that, or I at least pose the idea. And when I teach preaching, I encourage students to occasionally do a first-person monologue or first-person narrative. Actually, I even made your brother do this when he was in my Doctor of Ministry class.
Okay.
So I like to give people opportunity to think creatively about stories and characters and the like. And so I think like that can be a helpful tool to just think around a passage. And so inevitably, like I ended up doing when I was serving a church as a senior pastor, I did a first-person monologue of a wise man or a magi. And but I make the claim there. And so this is why it's a little easier to make a claim in a first-person sermon where I'm being creative and have like a little bit more creative license of like pointing back to this knowledge of messianic prophecies going back to Daniel. And that there could be some type of connection between, of course, we can't know for sure, but that possibly these wise men from the East could have been aware of some of Daniel's prophecies and that piece as well. So I threw that into that sermon there, but I actually heard kind of a hot take pastor put the same idea out there too. But I'm curious, like what you find about the what you talk about with reference to the magi or magoi here, thinking about who they are. And obviously, they have a literary role emphasizing the universal nature of the gospel. Again, like the same idea you said before, even with featuring Abraham in the genealogies and the so-called Great Commission being emphasized as going into all the world. So you have that prefigured with the Magi. So, but I'm just curious of what you've discovered about the Magi.
Yeah, I guess I don't get into that a ton in this book simply because I only need to say something about them insofar as they would be a problem for historiographic intent, right?
Okay, yeah.
So yeah, I really don't do a lot with them in this book. Although I think what I do want to say is they, if Matthew's saying that they came, they actually did come, right?
Yes,
and they're not simply a way of making a nice theological point. But yeah, I think I would probably just follow kind of the standard line coming down, from example, Raymond Brown and others that, they're people who have some experience with seeing the stars from this Eastern context, and somehow God is guiding them right to this place, using the star. And that doesn't necessarily mean that Scripture is affirming the legitimacy of astrology or something like that, but certainly God can work through their study of the stars and bring them to this place. Lots of questions, interestingly, about the star and how that works. Those ones, I think, come in when we're trying to ask the truth question and what exactly it would mean for a star to be guiding them to a particular location and all that. But yeah, lots more work to do. But I suppose in this book, I've tried to pave the way / open the door for doing some of that work in the future.
Right. Yeah. So that historical work could connect with people who study the stars, like to demonstrate the truthfulness of those claims. But yeah, that's really helpful. I'm curious what type of things now we're here in the Christmas season. You're actually recording this from another country, but we see these details of various events. Is there something historically that kind of like, as you've spent a lot of time looking at these birth narratives, you're like, oh, I wish they wouldn't say that, or I wish preachers wouldn't say that one, or is there some of these facts that like goes a little too far, connections you wish people could make to the actual text and what's being said that stands out to you?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a great question. Man, I think one thing I'd say is I just wish that I would love to see us just preaching from the stories themselves more.
Okay.
And I think I know that that the Advent season is a tough one because it comes around every year, right?
Right.
And I think sometimes that makes us feel like we have to get super creative. However, I just find it interesting how often I just haven't seen the basic things done of just preaching through the key stories, right? I think maybe part of the issue here is that what we think of as Christmas or Advent is not necessarily what the birth narratives are always focusing on, right? We kind of want to get the pieces of the nativity in place, and that's it becomes the nativity scene that's sort of guiding our interpretation, rather than thinking about what actually Matthew and Luke want to tell us. And for example, there, with Luke's birth story, how much of that is actually talking about John's birth? Right.
Yeah, sure.
And who he is, right? Now, obviously, he has something to say. John is getting ready for Jesus, right?
Pointing to Jesus.
That's worth preaching on. But if you're just trying to preach on the parts that have to do with the nativity scene, well, then you're going to leave out a lot of Luke 1-2. And think about how much of Luke's birth narrative and Matthew's actually happen after the birth, right? So we often think about, hey, we're just trying to get up to Christmas and get Jesus born, right?
Yeah, sure.
Well, Matthew has Jesus born after the first scene of his birth narrative.
Right.
Sure. It happens at the beginning of the second scene, and it's very, very brief, right? After Jesus was born in Bethlehem or something like that.
Yeah, sure.
So
there's not very much of a description at all. That's it. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think one thing I would just love to see is more pastors just feeling like, hey, I can dig into these stories and I don't have to let the nativity scene. By the way, I love nativity scenes, but you have to understand how they work, right? They are putting some things together that are important and some characters that all did make it there to see Jesus. But we should be letting the stories guide, the actual stories in the Gospels guide our sermons more than some idea that we have about what we need to fit in just to get Jesus born, and then leaving out so many of the other things that the Gospels are trying to tell us. Oh, but I will give you one little. This in terms of something that I do wish people would stop saying. By the way, something that I said myself before.
Okay, it's good.
With Matthew's genealogy. Again, one of the things that really just amazed me when looking at Matthew's genealogy is the Old Testament sources and how he's drawing on those. And often there will be this point that I know others have made too in the past about how Matthew is kind of doing this unusual thing of putting women into Jesus' genealogy. Well, what I found when actually doing the work for this book is Matthew finds most of the women he puts in the genealogy in his Old Testament sources.
Okay, it's already happened.
Even in genealogy. So
Yeah,
Chronicles,
sure.
I think, I want to say Chronicles has 2 or 3 of them already there, right? And so Matthew is actually following his source there. He's not actually doing something that's all that crazy. Now, it wasn't super normal, obviously, in the Old Testament genealogies either, but he's already finding that sort of impetus in his Old Testament source.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. It's a kind of a short point to make, and you can say, yeah, and women would have never been emphasized. And how many of us have done the work that you've done to go back and really look at? But we could even look in the Old Testament sources. Like, we have done that work. If you've read through the Bible in a year, you have done that work. It's just we're not paying rightly, like the Reader's Digest versions of the Bible cut out the genealogy. So it's easy for us to zoom past that. But maybe that's a reading strategy. Caleb, is like, okay, maybe as you get going in your reading of the historical books, the Old Testament, try to go ahead and look at the connections when they're used in Matthew and Luke.
Yeah. Tune into the genealogies. They're easy to skim, but there's some good stuff there. Yeah,
and I like that you brought up the end of Ruth. I find that genealogy interesting. The thing that has stood out to me there is that it goes to the last in the line, or the first, depends on how you look at it, is Perez. And to me, it's like not a character that's emphasized too much, but I think Perez is significant, and his name means breakthrough, burst through, perazim. And I found in 2 Chronicles 5, I want to say it is, maybe 2 Samuel 5. It says David names a place Baal Perazim, where the Lord burst through. I don't know. I think there's something significant to Perez in these passages. And I always think it's interesting that Ruth includes that. But And so who did you say uses Ruth, Matthew, or Luke? Do they both use?
Matthew does pretty clearly, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now,
Yeah, and I've got a.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just gonna say I have a one of the tables I have in the book is actually a table that goes through Matthew's genealogy. I think I have one for Luke as well. Basically, it shows where each name is coming from in the Old Testament. So yeah, if folks are interested in digging deeper on that, the book will give them a little bit of a starting place for that.
I mean, you're really highlighting that we're not just talking about if it is merely the intent is not to communicate anything historical. It ends up becoming about sentiments, for the modern reader. But really, we're describing, as I started off this podcast, I don't know, the most significant one of the, you talk about. I compare it to the resurrection or the creation. So okay, but one of the top 3 events in human history, universal history. So this is really about a revolutionary documentation of what's happening. This isn't just about feeling good about Jesus's connection to the past. I mean, of anything that needs an emphasis, the doctrine of incarnation. That is it. I'm so thankful for this work, Caleb.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, it's been a privilege to just have the time to study these stories, and I do think there's so much historical value here that sometimes we've missed, and I hope that this will encourage some more work in historical Jesus studies where we actually go and start taking these stories more seriously. But I also hope that it bears some fruit for the church and just gives pastors a confidence to go and proclaim these things. And not feel like they have to back off because, well, maybe this wasn't intended to be historical, or Matthew and Luke were just wanting to tell us some nice theology that doesn't have to do with history. And I want to say, I want to emphasize that the birth stories are theology and history, but it's theology done out of a regard for history and out of historical reality, not simply making things up. One thing, maybe just to come back to, since we were here earlier, and I don't want to forget it. You had talked about some of are there things in the birth stories?
Oh, yeah.
In the Gospels that kind of give me historical pause or something. Yeah. One thing I think is really important here and helpful in terms of just doing our study is, again, we're thinking about what kind of genre or kind of literature are we working within. And one of the things that's been really helpful that has come out of work that people like Mike Licona and Craig Keener have done on ancient biographies is recognizing that while these stories are based on sources, they are reliable, we can trust what the gospel authors are saying, we need to recognize the range of flexibility that they had in telling their stories. And this is one of the ways that ancient biographies are different from modern biographies. Ancient biographers had the freedom to sometimes compress timelines or to move the order of events and things like that. And that didn't mean that they were doing something other than historiography. That just meant that was the kind of historiography they were doing, right? So just for example, I already mentioned in the genealogies, like Matthew, clearly, I think, leaves out some generations that Chronicles has. And that's not a problem for me because I recognize that Matthew is writing a Jewish genealogy, and this is a convention in Jewish genealogy. So when I read Matthew's genealogy, I kind of now have this knowledge that something like was the father of or begat in the King James, right? That this doesn't necessarily indicate a biological or direct fatherhood of that person. It may, but it can simply mean something like was the ancestor of, right? And in the same similar way to how we might say that, Jesus was the son of David. Well, what do you mean by the son, right? Like David is his great to the nth grandfather, right? So there's a flexibility there that we have to recognize and be okay with, and I'm fine with that. We need to recognize that when we're reading a genealogy, that's what it's doing, and we shouldn't hold it to an unrealistic standard of truth that's alien to Matthew's intent, let's say. But and just another place where that would come up too would be something like the timeline and sort of the itinerary from Jesus and his family getting from Bethlehem to Nazareth, right?
Yes.
So if you read Luke's story, for example, it seems like it takes maybe a couple months for them to get to Nazareth, right?
Mm.
So you have Jesus born, you then have this period before they go to the temple. It seems like it's about 40 days. They're gonna go to the temple and meet Simeon and Anna, and then they head home. So we're talking maybe 2 max 3 months, something like that, to get them to Nazareth. And in Matthew's story, obviously, it's going to take them, it seems like, years perhaps to get to Nazareth. I mean, they've got the whole journey to Egypt. Yeah. So Luke doesn't say anything about Egypt, and Matthew seems to get them to Nazareth much later. And that's not, now to modern readers, that may not be the way that you would like Matthew and Luke to tell you the story, right?
Right, sure.
But one of the things that Michael Licona has pointed out in his work on ancient biographies, and Craig Keener's confirmed it too, is that there was this thing that we call compression,
right?
That ancient biographers could do, where they could simplify and compress a timeline to where something appeared like it had occurred over a longer or shorter period of time than it actually occurred. So I think that probably what's going on here is that Luke is engaging in some compression, and he may well know that it took Jesus and his family longer to get to Nazareth, but he's not going to tell you about all the details of that. And he's also not going to kind of break the flow of his story by giving you this excursus on why he's not going to tell you that, right? He's going to tell you a story that is elegant and flows well, but also we need to recognize that there's a level of flexibility in that. And by the way, I find this, we talked about inerrancy earlier, I find this very helpful for inerrancy too, to say, when I'm dealing with this genre of ancient biography, it's reliable, but it's also, there's a flexibility here that I need to be attentive to, so that as someone who believes in inerrancy, that I'm not holding these stories up to an unrealistic standard that was alien to their author's intent.
Right. Yeah, you're understanding that intent better. You're trying to understand that in a more full context. So yeah, that's so helpful. Like, they're trying to do something. They're working in this genre of ancient biography, and if that's how they're working, it's not going to satisfy our need for information always being in the exact way that we would like it presented. Like, we want, and this would happen too. Like, I mean, you can even just think of like modern movies that are biopics or something. Like, you don't get all of the details that moves us from one place to other. Instead, we're hearing a story, which is historically true, right? But it's nevertheless like trying to communicate a specific point. And that's like what we see happening with Matthew and Luke. Yeah, that's so helpful. Caleb, this is great research and something that's really helpful. I have so much more to think about as a result of this, but I'm thankful for this work. What do you hope? You mentioned like you hope scholars will do more work, and this obviously will impact the church. I just think everybody, one of the great things that happens, I remember when I was serving as a senior pastor, I would often find myself going back to some of the same biblical resources for Easter and Advent. And so I hope people need to get your book, because this is going to be such a great resource as they're thinking about these important texts. But what are you hopeful will happen from a scholarly perspective? Like, where do you think people might go from here?
Yeah. Well, the subtitle to the book is Reopening a Closed Case. And what I would say is, for a long time, we've regarded the gospel birth narratives as being a place that just aren't really relevant in the Gospels for historical research. And what I want to say in this book is that they are relevant because they're intended to be historical, and as ancient biography or ancient birth narratives and ancient biographies were. And not only that, but they're writing far closer to the events they're reporting than most ancient biographers were. So if anything, we should be taking these sources incredibly seriously from a historical standpoint. So I would love to see more historical Jesus work engage with the gospel birth narratives. And that's true whatever kind of perspective the authors are coming from, right? Someone may want to take a naturalistic or anti-supernatural approach to doing history. And I think even for that kind of scholar, even if you're going to say that's your starting point, that's fine. That's not a starting point I agree with. But if that's your starting point, I still think you need to be starting with these stories and including them in your account. Right. And then say, okay, how do I negotiate what's going on here? But, just a very basic point would be, many scholars tend to say, if they talk about where Jesus was born, they'll say that he was born in Nazareth. Well, we don't have a single ancient source that claims he was born in Nazareth, right? And we have two quite early ones in the grand scheme of things, Matthew and Luke, that tell us he was born in Bethlehem. So I think that it should be fairly self-evident moving forward that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And that should just be something that any scholar is able to affirm, because there's nothing even supernatural about being born in Bethlehem, right?
Yeah,
you don't even have to affirm the legitimacy.
you might be able to
of miracle.
deny the virgin birth. You might you might think that Joseph is the father of Jesus biologically, but you can't. There's no reason beyond the fact that Jesus was from Nazareth to be able to deny Bethlehem.
Right. So just some of those basic points. I would just love to see some of these especially more significant works on the historical Jesus going forward. If somebody writes a 400 or 500 page book on Jesus' life, or even a 200 or 300 page book, I would love to see the gospel birth narratives play a significant role in that and just say something about Jesus's birth and early life. I think that it's worth digging into, and we have good reasons to take these sources seriously historically.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, Caleb, I think this is the third time you've been on the podcast. I think I had you on to talk about the Holiness book when you were here for the Chamberlain lectures, and then I also had you on to talk about the book on good works. But so maybe I've asked this question before, but the title of my podcast is More to the Story, and I'm curious if there's more to the story of Caleb. Maybe this will be a repeat. I don't know. Maybe you've already given me an answer before, but some things have happened since the last time I saw you, or last time I had you on the podcast, that is. So is there more to the story of Caleb Friedeman?
Well, my wife and I actually had our first son back in March, our first child, who is a son, back in March. And he's coming up on 9 months old right now and is crawling around like crazy. So just trying to keep up with him on a daily basis keeps our lives interesting. But we love him and he's doing great. So yeah, really enjoying that. And yeah, I suppose that's probably the newest addition to the story since the last time we talked.
Well, I see you dedicate the book to him as well, so that's really sweet.
I did, yeah.
That's great. Well, Caleb, thanks so much for your time. We obviously at WBS, we're so proud to be connected to you, your family, but this work too that's going to just continue to help us treasure this truth of the incarnation of the Son of God. And I'm so thankful for these birth narratives, which take on more meaning for me now than they did an hour and a half ago when we started this conversation.
Well, thanks for having me on, Andy. It's been a pleasure.